There's this famous scene in David Fincher's 1990 film Fight Club, where the character Tyler Durden points a gun at a young man named Raymond K. Hessel. In the scene, it is let known that Raymond is working a dead-end job and lives in a crappy basement apartment. Tyler tells Raymond,
"Raymond, you're going to die,"
and asks him what he wanted to be.
"Raymond was what did you want to be?"
Raymond tells Tyler he always wanted to be a veterinarian, but explains how there's just too much school involved.
"Too much school." "Would you rather be dead?"
Tyler then tells Raymond that he knows where he lives, and if he isn't on his way to becoming a vet, he'll return and kill him. I bring up the scene because it's easy to become complacent and forget about what we initially set out to do in this life. And sometimes finding out about a deadline is the only way to become motivated. The deadline in this case being mortality. Ikiru is a 1952 film directed by the master himself, Akira Kurosawa. It's based off of Leo Tolstoy's novel, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. This is also no surprise considering Kurosawa is an avid reader of Russian literature, which can be seen in many of his films. The story is about Kanji Watanabe, played by the great Takashi Shimura. Mr. Watanabe is a bureaucrat that has worked in the same department for over 30 years. His life is pretty boring and meaningless. One day he discovers that he has stomach cancer and has less than a year to live. Being diagnosed with cancer was the moment his life truly began. He then makes it his mission to leave something meaningful behind. The title of the film, Ikiru, translates to live, and that's exactly what this film is about. What is it to really live a meaningful life? One that doesn't just involve going to a job every day and repeating it. This film points out the importance of living a fulfilling life and how it sometimes takes the motivation of being told you don't have much time left to live. The film takes place in modern Japan, which was the 1950s when this film released. This is right after World War II, and a time when a lot of people in Japan were questioning the meaning of life. Why does this all matter? What makes me happy? Is it making a lot of money? Is it just working a job? Ikiru covers all these questions. The film begins in an office building with a narrator telling us how Mr. Watanabe has stomach cancer but doesn't know it yet. The narrator then explains how up until this point, he has not lived. Instead, he's done nothing in his whole bureaucratic life, except hold on to his position. The scene transfers over to a group of women that enter the office building. They are hoping that someone will fix the contaminated area in the neighborhood. One by one, we watch each bureaucrat come up with an excuse to steer the woman towards someone else to deal with. It goes on endlessly until the women give up. This lets us know early on how no one seems to want to do anything except rise higher in the ranks and make more money, never taking any risks so that they could hold on to their positions, essentially never doing anything with their lives. In flashbacks, we learned that Mr. Watanabe's wife tragically died at a young age when their son was just a child. The film lets it be known that he spent 30 years being devoted to raising his son and working a bureaucratic life, never really having a chance to do what he wanted. When he becomes diagnosed with stomach cancer, he becomes depressed and doesn't tell his family, which all seem to just be annoyed by his existence. The first part of the film is actually very bleak and isolating. Characters show very little compassion, especially towards the main character. There's a scene early on where he overhears his son and daughter-in-law talking about how they can't wait to inherit his fortune. This is especially hard-hitting for Mr. Watanabe, considering that he gave up his hopes and dreams in order to devote to his son. When Mr. Watanabe gets diagnosed with cancer, he doesn't tell anyone, and he's all alone dealing with this awful news in isolation. The beginning of Ikiru is actually very similar to the opening of the show Breaking Bad, and in a number of ways. When the main character Walter White finds out he has cancer, he keeps it to himself at first. Also, both Kanji Watanabe and Walter White make drastic life changes after hearing the news of their cancer. Breaking Bad is essentially the plot of Ikiru. Feeling depressed and alone, Mr. Watanabe goes to a local bar and meets up with a novelist. He tells the novelist about his diagnosis, and it's actually the only person in the entire movie that he ends up telling. And he asks him how to spend his money in the best way possible. Out of disbelief at this request, the novelist then shows him how to have a good time. They go out into the city and party like there's no tomorrow, spending the fortune that he worked his whole life for. At a bar, Mr. Watanabe requests the song Gondola no Uda. It's a song about life being brief, and it's from his childhood. He then starts singing it, and he sings it so passionately that everyone at the bar stops what they're doing and is stunned by his passion. This is definitely one of the most devastating close-ups in all of cinema. The most powerful thing about actor Shimura is his eyes. We feel him pour his life and soul into this one song. This entire part with the city and Mr. Watanabe partying has always been one of my favorite parts in this film. Kurosawa does a great job making the city come to life, and you really feel like you're in 1950s Japan. It's filmed in such a great way where it actually makes you feel like you were there with Mr. Watanabe, partying like it's your last night. I'll also add that all the visuals in this film are Kurosawa quality. You really feel the filth and garbage of the industrial setting, the fast pace of city life. Dark shadows are cast over the main character to show his bleak emotions. Partying just gives Mr. Watanabe an empty feeling. He realizes that there's nothing to look forward to. It's here that he decides the only way his life can have any meaning would be if he left something behind. This little message right here is perhaps the most powerful thing in this film, and perhaps the most powerful message out of all of Kurosawa's films. Mr. Watanabe being unable to talk to even his son is very detrimental to his own being. Alone, people are unable to overcome their problems, but with help, one can build a foundation into something that seems impossible. In the next scene, Mr. Watanabe runs into a coworker that's actually a young woman. He ends up asking her this simple question. She then explains how she gets joy from creating something. In Japan, this is known as Ikigai, a Japanese belief that translates to a reason for being. Mr. Watanabe's bureaucratic life gave him no passion. His mindset then changes when he realizes what he can do with his position. He then uses the rest of his strength and passion to do what is right. This next part is a bit of a spoiler, so you could skip to this time if you don't want to be spoiled. Mr. Watanabe ends up using his job to help the community, something he's forgotten in his 30 years of his profession. He ends up listening to the woman from the beginning and building a community park, and it's his journey in pushing to construct this, which would be considered his magnum opus. The film is actually told in two parts. The first, about hour and 50 minutes of the film, is from Mr. Watanabe's point of view, and the second half of the film is taken from the point of view of his family, friends, and co-workers. The second half takes place during his funeral and explains the aftermath of what his life really meant, and it's from the eyes of the people close to him. Having two halves is actually a pretty risky screenwriting move, but it adds more meaning to Mr. Watanabe's journey, showing that his impact actually meant something. This is also unfortunately where the film slows down a little bit, and we're introduced to new characters. But ultimately, I'd say it pays off. Each of the characters that were close to Mr. Watanabe discussed their bafflement in his change in character, and eventually they actually realized that he devoted his final days into fulfilling an idea that he thought was wholeheartedly meaningful, something that gave his life meaning. There's always one standout moment of awe in each of Kurosawa's films, where a scene grabs your attention and you never forget. In this film, it's the very last scene, and it involves our main character in the snow, on the swing, singing the same song from the beginning. When we first heard him sing this song, he was sad and crying, but now we see him smiling and happy. He's also no longer hunched over in pain like he was throughout the entire movie. There's also snowfall, which contrasts with the rest of the film, where everything was hot and sticky and sweaty. It's one of the most emotional scenes I've ever seen in any film. This film is very personal to me, and it's really relatable, considering I had a battle with cancer, just like Mr. Watanabe. And just like how it motivated Mr. Watanabe and even Walter White, it motivated me to make me want to do YouTube videos. I wanted to leave something behind. Successfully leaving your mark on this world is what everyone should seek out doing, because we're here one day and gone the next. The title Ikiru, meaning to live, describes exactly what this film is about. What does it mean to live? Is it just living an unfulfilling job that just gets you by? Or would you rather die having a smile on your face, knowing that you actually made your mark in this world? It's something you created on your own, and something you actually created will live on. This is one of those special films that you'd never forget. It's also a very warm and joyful film that I often find myself watching around Christmas, just because it goes with that same feeling of the season. I hope this film ends up bringing you that same joy. Thanks for watching.
Also